As many of you know, Jack Provencha was a beloved member of our community here, and his life in person and his interest in ethics really launched a concern for ethics on our campus and at the medical center. And he and his colleagues developed a Center for Christian Bioethics where I now work, and from that perspective, I am able to introduce to the community lecturers on various topics and to bring to you these sorts of events. And so I'm very pleased to welcome all of you on the behalf of the Center for Christian Bioethics here at Loma Linda University. We will talk for the next 10 weeks on Thursday nights on the topic of physician-assisted suicide. You may wonder why on earth we would want to spend so much time thinking and talking about physician-assisted suicide. One of the reasons is because of a bill that I hold here in my hands, Bill AB number 651, that the California State Legislature is looking at right now and considering in terms of law for our state. It's called the California Compassionate Choices Act. It's been through the Assembly, modified, and sent on to the Senate. And if the Senate, as I understand the legislative process, if the Senate approves it, it goes to the governor's desk and he signs it, and then the lawsuits begin, right? Isn't that typically the way it works? At any rate, this legislation allows physicians in the state of California to prescribe a lethal dosage of medication for their patients, if their patients request it. It's legal, as you know, in the state of Oregon. It has been for about 7 years, and California is moving in that direction. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring these speakers together. We'd like to focus specifically on religious perspectives in these lecture series, this lecture series, and so I have invited a number of different speakers from a number of different religious perspectives. As you probably know, Dennis Prager tonight comes from a Jewish perspective. Next week, Rabbi David Novak also speaks from a Jewish perspective. We have Muslim lecturer coming. We have a Hindu lecturer coming. A number of Seventh-day Adventist lecturers, including Ben Carson, who most of you probably know, and a great number of them. You'll see in the brochure, they're all listed with the particular religious perspective that they will speak from. One of the nice things about the Center for Christian Bioethics is that it is supported by the generosity of all of you folks. Many of you here I know are supporters, financial supporters. But one of the realities of offering these lectures free to the public is the fact of the expense. Normally we would have a conference where people pay a fee to come and attend a conference. This year we thought we'd try something new and provide these lectures free to the public so that we could broaden the conversation. So I'm hoping that you won't mind noticing the donation baskets toward the end of the meetings in all of the exits. If you wish to have a note or a record for charitable donations, that's easily enough managed. But I wanted to draw your attention to that. Let me move now to introducing our speaker for the night. Dennis Prager is here. Most of you know he's a well-known radio personality. Since 1982, he's been on the radio in the Los Angeles area. He became nationally syndicated in 1999. He has both academic and popular background. Some of the books that he has written, one about anti-Semitism, published in August of 2003, reissued at that time, titled Why the Jews, co-authored, co-written with Joseph Telyushkin. Another book, I'm told one of his best, Happiness is a Serious Problem. And another one, probably the one most widely sold and distributed, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. He has been a fellow in his academic work at the Columbia University School of International Affairs, where he did graduate work at the Middle East and Russian Institutes. He has taught Russian and Jewish history at Brooklyn College and was appointed during President Reagan's presidency to the U.S. delegation to the Vienna Review Conference on the Helsinki Accords. I could go on at length. One of the things that I was excited about when I visited with Mr. Prager over the phone was the Q&A, the question and answer time after the talk. So I hope you'll anticipate staying for those questions and answers after the formal lecture. Please do limit your questions to the topic of the night. Now, I know you folks listen to them, and you probably all come with questions about this, what did you say then, and so on and so forth. And we could go on at length tonight, but I'll ask you to mind your P's and Q's and focus in tonight on this particular topic, okay? Without any further ado, Mr. Dennis Prager.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Carr, thank you so much, and thank you all. This is a real honor to be asked to open up your distinguished series at this distinguished university, and to try to do justice to the oldest of the traditions, the Jewish one. I normally speak, well, actually I speak, as many of you know, on everything. But one of the more common topics that I'm asked to lecture around the country, and for that matter abroad, is on happiness. And it's a real change of pace to speak on physician-assisted suicide. Not the happiest of topics, as you would well imagine. In fact, I was considering physician-induced suicide this afternoon driving here from Los Angeles. I understood its appeal, frankly, at a number of moments. It's a very long trip during rush hour, in case you didn't know. So really, I'm very delighted, and I'm very happy that I'm the first, because I am going to try to present to you the broad issues involved here that all the religious traditions are going to have to address. And of course, I will speak specifically from the point of view of Judaism. And I think you'll find a fair amount of this perhaps even new and hopefully thought-provoking. It certainly, it provoked me to think about this. It's ironic, had we been living on the East Coast, I would have courteously declined the invitation and asked you to invite my brother, who is the head of medical ethics at Columbia University, Columbia, New York Presbyterian Hospital. So I hope some of his insights have rubbed off on me. But this is a huge subject. I am tempted to say to you that there's no question. You want the Jewish position? Life is of infinite value, and unless the person is a murderer or you're saving somebody's life, you can't take it. Any questions? I could do that. I could stand up here and tell you that is the position. Human life is of infinite worth, and you can't take it under any conditions, and you can't take your own under any conditions. I could say that, and there are Jewish halachists. It's a term you should know. A halachist is Jewish law. A halachist is a Jewish legal expositor or adjudicator. So that would be their way of saying, and they would be right. How important is human life in the Jewish tradition? Well, I'll tell you what I learned when I was in first grade in yeshiva, Jewish religious school. The Talmud, which is the greatest source of Jewish law after the Bible, the Talmud has a very interesting question. Lama, and I'll only tell it to you in Hebrew, not to show off my Hebrew, but rather so you'll know it's so common in Judaism that you end up learning it by heart. Like e pluribus unum, even if you don't know Latin, most of you would know, from many one, which is on our coinage. Lama nivra Adam yechidi. Why was Adam created singularly? Why didn't God create a bunch of people to begin with? And then the answer that is given is, so as to teach you, there were two reasons actually. One is that nobody could say that my father or my ancestor is more valuable than yours, because that way we all come from the same ancestor. That is one reason. The other one is to teach you that if, let us say, somebody had taken Adam's life, someone had killed Adam, someone would have killed the entire human race, correct? And that's what it is. That is what God, or at least Genesis, wanted to teach. If you take a human life, it is equivalent to taking the life of the whole human race. That's a very powerful idea because, in fact, the fact that there are 6 billion of us is coincidental to the idea of what the loss is of a human life. I think about this. It was drilled into me as a child so much in my Jewish religious studies that is the basis, and this will strike some of you undoubtedly, and certainly strikes many of my listeners as peculiar. That is exactly why I am for capital punishment for murder. Murder is so terrible that only through taking the murderer's life can we say to society how terrible murder is. Now, others will say, what are you, crazy? You teach that killing is wrong by killing? That is the usual response. William Buckley had a great response to that response. He said, well, we teach that kidnapping is wrong by kidnapping. What do we do with the kidnapper? We kidnap him and take him to prison. I mean, that's exactly what you teach. Of course, that's how you teach it. But in any event, I have always been preoccupied with the knowledge of how terrible murder is. How much is lost? I'll give you another teaching from the Jewish sources. And any of you who know the Bible, many of you as Christians, will know the famous one about God saying to Cain after he killed his brother Abel, where is your brother, and so on. And he says, this is what is fascinating. The Hebrew, and I won't give it to you in Hebrew, but I'll give it to you in a literal translation. We usually translate it as, the blood of your brother is crying out to me. But not in the Hebrew. The original Hebrew is, the bloods of your brother are crying out to me. That's fascinating. It's never used anywhere else. What bloods? Blood in Hebrew, like English, doesn't have a plural. We don't have bloods. There were many bloods on the floor after an accident. We don't say that, nor do we in Hebrew. But there it's different. The bloods of your brother are crying out to me. And again, the Talmud has an explanation. Because when you murder someone, you have not only murdered them, but all the offspring that would have come from that person. So look at the staggering toll of a murder, of taking an innocent life. You have taken that person's life and all the future lives that would have emanated from that person, and you have, in effect, killed the whole world. Which is another Talmudic phrase, whoever saves one life is considered to have saved the entire world. And there's another reason, aside from the Adam reason, because Adam was the entire world, the other reason is that you and I are all entire worlds. We are mini universes, you and I, whole worlds. When you, God forbid, or I am killed, an entire universe, a unique universe has died. It will never be replicated. Every one of us is so utterly unique. I've often thought the most boring person on earth could have an interesting biography written of him or her. What has happened to every one of you in this auditorium is fascinating and utterly unique. There is such a thing only in a very different way. There is an average Joe. And it's not bad to be an average Joe. But the truth is, there really isn't an average Joe. Every one of us is so incredibly unique, and that is why we have to bear that in mind when taking a life. I'll give it to you in the description in a book in Jewish Bioethics, it's titled, perfectly appropriate, by two rabbis, J. David Bleich and Fred Rosner. The value of human life is infinite and beyond measure, so that any part of life, even if only an hour or a second, is of precisely the same worth as 70 years of it, just as any fraction of infinity being indivisible, remains infinite. Accordingly, to kill a decrepit patient approaching death constitutes exactly the same crime of murder as to kill a young, healthy person who may still have many decades to live. Now, this runs against our common sense. I fully acknowledge that, and I will talk about the other side. There is another side to all of this. Otherwise, I would take questions now. You know, human life is infinitely precious. What would you like to know? But no, there is more to be said. But this is the most orthodox approach that I'm reading to you, that there is no difference in taking a human life of someone who is old and decrepit, as is put, and a 22-year-old strapping young person. For the same reason one life is worth as much as 1,000 or 1,000,000 lives, infinity is not increased by multiplying it. That was taught to me too in yeshiva, that you can't, 1,000 lives are not 1,000 times more valuable than one life. That is why I disagreed with Israel. Israel, which is not run necessarily, and usually not, by Jewish law. It's a secular state with many religious people in it. And they are banned capital punishment, except with one exception, Nazi war criminals. So in all of Israel's history, since 1948, when it was established, it executed one murderer, Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. And I was, not at the time, I was 12 years old, but subsequently I became very angry because to me it went very much against Jewish values what Israel did. Because what Israel was saying there was, if you kill millions, you deserve to die. But if you kill one, you don't deserve to die. Well, what kind that's not a Jewish message. And so that's very important what he is saying. I understand that. Now, obviously, from any human level, we have lost our common sense if we don't recoil more. If 1,000 are killed, if 100 are killed by a terrorist in Baghdad, than if one is killed. Because 100 infinities have been destroyed. So it is more angering, and we understand that. But on a moral plane, you can't say, oh, it's only one. This explains the unconditional Jewish opposition to deliberate euthanasia, as well as to the surrender of one hostage in order to save the others if the whole group is otherwise threatened with death. It's very interesting. Some of you may know I am not a television watcher, but my sons get around that by getting DVDs of television programs because I allow DVDs. So, for some reason, I find that more palatable. I don't know why. And I end up watching it with them. That's the joke. And there is this program, 24 Hours, which I think is addictive. I mean, it is like, to me, it is somewhat like audible and visual cocaine. What, you know, I can't leave to the bathroom while watching. So there was an episode that I was seeing, I don't remember from which year, just watching recently, where the leading guy, Sutherland, is the actor's name, and he is, this is the story. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating moral question. This woman terrorist has a gun on him, a machine gun, and they're talking to the President of the United States because she knows where the bomb that will be detonated in LA, but not reach Loma Linda, because it would be rush hour and all the cars would block the radiation. Anyway, she knows the guy, the arch terrorist who knows where the bomb is in LA. And she wants to get a presidential pardon, but she wants to kill Sutherland as well because she believes he'll kill her or whatever reason. He's a good guy. So they have the President of the United States on a cell phone. Said, I want your word that I will be pardoned not just for what I've done in the past, but for killing him now. And he says, Sutherland, the good guy, Mr. President, you have to do this. you have to pardon her for killing me in order to save God knows how many people in Los Angeles. And I was saying in front of my sons, Mr. President, don't do it. Don't make the deal. Don't make the deal. But it's an interesting question. Can you take the life of an innocent in advance for saving others and so on? But this is extreme is not the best word, but this is the most fundamentalist, also not a good word. All of these are loaded words. But it's the most black and white of the positions, and it is a standard Orthodox halachic position. Again, halachic being Jewish law. But it is very important to know the centrality of the sanctity of human life in Judaism, emanating, of course, originally from the Bible. Number two, from a Jewish perspective, and this is where this is something you will find of interest if you're not Jewish, because I think that the preciousness of life is taken for granted, more or less. But this part now becomes more interesting in that it starts to differ a little from other religions, not all other religions, although perhaps all other religions, and that is how this life-centered Judaism is. You can't understand Jews, and I mean secular Jews, not just religious Jews, if you don't understand how this life-oriented Judaism is. Now, this emanates from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses itself, because interestingly enough, though Judaism has always affirmed an afterlife, the Torah is silent on the question of afterlife. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are silent about something that is pretty significant, wouldn't you say? Where do we go when we die? And I have wrestled with this question a great deal. Why would the Torah be silent about an afterlife? And I have concluded that it is because here is a nutshell way of understanding the Torah. It is overwhelmingly a reaction against Egypt. The Jews were to reject everything that Egypt stood for, and the first thing that Egypt stood for, talking ancient Egypt, although there are parallels to a certain extent, but it's only ancient Egypt that I'm talking about. The thing that characterized ancient Egypt and its faith, its religion, its outlook on life was its preoccupation with death. What are the pyramids? People forget this. The pyramids, where so many lives were expended building them, so much treasure, so much time, they are tombs. The most important monument of ancient Egypt is a tomb. The Bible of ancient Egypt was the book of the dead. Egypt was preoccupied with afterlife, with death. Therefore, the Torah, I am convinced, is silent on it because the generations that came from Egypt had to wean themselves utterly away from preoccupation with what happens after life and preoccupation in order to be preoccupied with what happens in this life. This is new. By and large, religion tends to be preoccupied often with what happens afterwards. Even in Eastern religion, that is so, where you have the concept of coming back into this life. And you'll come back and you will come back until in Buddhism you finally attain enlightenment, and then finally there's nothing. Judaism has always been preoccupied with this life, and it is part of the reason that many Jews who are not religious, which is most Jews, are also preoccupied with this life and with ideologies that fix this world. One of the reasons for Jewish activism, and I will be making this point in my series of columns this year, my syndicated column called Explaining Jews. So if you can see my column on the internet, or if your local paper has it, I don't know, I will deal with this issue in one of those columns. Jews, religious and even anti-religious Jews, are still preoccupied with what's called improving the world, repairing the world, perfecting the world. A very deep sense, often I think, unfortunately, utilizing means that are not mine, not using religiously grounded or even Jewishly grounded means, but nevertheless preoccupied with fixing this world. Karl Marx was the grandson of two Orthodox rabbis, and of course hated Judaism, and in fact hated Jews. But he was still heir to the notion that, damn those Christians. Those Christians are, what they have done, they got people to think about the next life so that they could live in poverty in this life and never revolt. He was speaking as if you will, a radically secularized Jewish mind. We got to fix this world, and you who aren't revolting against the bad conditions of this world, there is something wrong with you. You have been given religion, which is the opiate of the masses. That's the title that Marx and Lenin give to religion. And so they would hate religion because it fostered passivity in their view in the light of human evil. Of course, it's nonsense. It was Christians, not Marxists, who abolished slavery. Of course, it was, it's a given, but people don't think about that. Christians were not exactly all retreating to monasteries to pray the rest of their lives. They were involved tremendously in all sorts of works to improve the lot of their fellow human being. But it didn't matter. There was enough of what he saw as passivity in the face of evils in this world, injustices, inequalities, to have him think that religion was an opium. So this world is all there is. That's a bastardization of the Jewish concept that this world is where our focus must be. Now, there is a danger on both sides. There is a danger of only being focused on this world, and you end up with, first of all, ultimately a meaningless life. If there's really nothing after this life, then well, what is this? This is just, we're here for a snap of the finger, and then we disappear, and we're just like, we're a pebble that gets eroded and becomes sand, and that's all we are. Excuse me. But aside from that, it doesn't work just to have a materialist view. The only reality is material. It doesn't work. The ideas that came from that didn't help the world. You need a transcendent source of morality and so on. But there is the other danger of being preoccupied with the next world. This too is a danger. Look at the Islamic terrorist. The motto of Hamas, their motto, they say it with pride: we love death as much as the Jews love life. Because that's their fight, is with Israel primarily, and they call them the Jews, not the Israelis. And that's what they always say. And they're right. I often believe that one has to take one's enemy seriously in their proclamations. He is absolutely right. They are absolutely right. They love death as much as the Jews, and you certainly could add the Christians love life. That is absolutely correct. That's the other danger. This life doesn't matter. What matters is afterwards. But to understand the Jewish view on the subject matter, physician-assisted suicide, one must understand the preoccupation with this life and the preoccupation with the infinite value of life. And now the key is to understand that they go against one another. Because once you are preoccupied with this life, and not only with the transcendent source of value of life, then you are starting to ask questions like, what is the quality of your life? And as soon as the question of quality of life is offered, then you get into the realm of, when can we take it? Or when can I take my own? So that brings me to the question of when, in fact, life can be taken, if at all. In Judaism, there are 3 times only when you are to die rather than violate a commandment. As you know, Judaism is a law-based religion. You are never to violate the commandments, especially, let us say, the Sabbath, which has a particularly holy function. Since this is a Seventh-day Adventist university, you can appreciate it even better if you are SDA. And in Jewish life, the Sabbath, which emanates from the 10 Commandments, has a unique status, and one doesn't violate laws pertaining to the Sabbath, except to save a life. If there is even to save a life for 1 minute, to prolong a life for 1 minute, you are considered by the most orthodox rabbinic sources to be a murderer if you thought you're so pious that you would not violate the Sabbath to save a life. It is a sin to keep the Sabbath if you are in any doubt about the person's health and about a life being endangered. That is why Orthodox doctors will work on the Sabbath as doctors. No other Jew is permitted to work on the Sabbath. Only a doctor, because they are in the business of saving lives. The 3 instances, in case you're curious, of where you have to die rather than violate a Jewish law, here are the 3. The most obvious and clear is, if I say to you, kill such and such, or I'll kill you, you cannot kill such and such. If that you can't. You have to die. Ideally, you'd kill me. I mean, that is the Jewish view. If you know, that way you get rid of the whole problem. But you cannot go and kill the innocent to save your life. The second exception is sexual sin, and it's usually understood as incest, because it so violates the centrality of what Judaism wants to make, and the price paid is so awful that apparently, according to Jewish law, that is, you would die rather than violate that. And the third one is public idol worship. So that, in other words, if somebody were to say to you, I want you to now go to the Jewish community and announce that you now worship Baal, Canaanite god, and you then bow down and try to lead others to it, otherwise I will kill you. You have to be killed rather than do that. Those are the only 3 exceptions to violating Jewish law. Otherwise, you always preserve your own life, let alone preserve anybody else. Now let me read to you a story which directly deals with our question here. This is from the Talmud. This is a true story. The Romans burned a number of rabbis, tortured a number of rabbis alive. The Talmud tells a story, and in this story, Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion was being burned alive by the Romans. His pupils urged him to end his suffering quickly by opening his mouth and taking deep breaths of smoke and flames. But he replied, "It is better that he who gave me my soul should take it, rather than I should cause injury to myself." Now, here is a very interesting story for those of you who believe that suicide, which is, after all, remember, it's physician, we're emphasizing, when we think about this question, physician-assisted. But let's just deal with suicide. Forget physician-assisted. How about self-assisted suicide? I tell you at the outset, if I were being burned alive, I would do everything possible to hasten my death. Everything possible, and I would help you to do everything possible to hasten your death. But if you're an absolutist, and I'll bet there are many here who are, and I say that only with respect, because we're talking about the greatest issue of all, preservation of human life. But if you're an absolutist, then the pupils of Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion were in fact wrong. The rabbi should have done everything possible to keep himself burning. But there's got to be a voice in even the biggest absolutist that says, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. How is that a religious duty? On the other hand, one could say, did this rabbi not honor God by his response? And I think he did. Now remember, if the rabbi would have said, don't you dare give advice to so-and-so who's being burned alive, I would think we had a real fool here. But if he himself is prepared to suffer more until he is naturally dead, as opposed to hastening his death because he thinks it honors the fact that God is the giver and taker of life, I cannot say that this man did not do something heroic. That's why I say on the radio very often, I am not interested in making saints. I am interested in making people as little better. That to me would be a great achievement. Just make people a little kinder, a little more empathetic. What this rabbi did is, although Judaism doesn't have the word saint, nevertheless, this is saintly behavior. This is the ultimate in piety. He is being consistent with the notion that there should never be suicide. Because if in fact he did open his mouth to receive the smoke and die sooner, he is committing suicide. If you are absolutist on this issue, he should have allowed himself to suffer as much as possible till the flames naturally killed him. So I am here because I want to challenge you, not for the sake of challenging, but because it is challenging. This subject is not as easy as even those of us who believe in the infinite preciousness of life and who are opposed to the Oregon law or any similar law in California or elsewhere. Even if you are opposed to it, you cannot deny the complexity of the question. And that is why I give you this rabbi being burned alive as an example. Did he do right or did he do wrong? Would he have sinned if he hastened? What if it were happening now and somebody could sneak him a gun to kill himself while being burned? Would you say, Rabbi, you just can't do that. You're not only a religious person, you're a man of the cloth. You have to allow yourself to be burned to death. It's very, very hard to imagine many people saying that, but again, strictly speaking, that would in fact be the thing to recommend. That's why I want you to understand how complex the subject is. That's why I didn't get up and say, life is infinitely precious, any questions? Because that's not enough to know when you deal with the question of physician-assisted suicide. Because there is a competing value to the preciousness of life, and that's the next part of this talk. The competing value is reduction of human suffering. Suffering is a moral question, just as life is a moral question to Judaism. And I dare say it is more so to Judaism than to Christianity, and though I am a religious Jew, I am not taking sides on this. I happen to believe both are right. But there is no doubt in my mind that there is a different Christian approach and a different Jewish approach to the question of suffering. And that is, and I will give it to you in a light way and in a serious way. And the serious way is that for Christians, suffering is often regarded as a form of imitation of Christ. It is a way of achieving a certain degree of closeness to God that is not available otherwise. It has a religious value to many Christians. To Jews, suffering stinks. Period. End of issue. Told you there's a light way to tell this. This is my dream sociology exam or study. Get 50 Jews, doesn't matter to me, religious, secular, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, 50 Jews and 50 Christians. I don't care if they're Catholic, Protestant, any variation on anything that affirms Jesus Christ. You take the 50 Jews and the 50 Christians and you bring them into a hotel under some other, reasoning, and they don't know it's a sociology study, and you serve them all lunch, and you give them all equally unripe cantaloupe. I would bet you everything I have, you'd have far more complaints from the Jews about the cantaloupe than from the Christians. There is no doubt. I tell this story to Jews and they totally agree. They crack up. There's no question. What? Unripe cantaloupe for the chosen people? That's impossible. No. That's my joke about, why would Jews complain more? It is not because of the chosen people notion. Most of Jews are very uncomfortable with that. I happen to believe it. I'm religious, but that's not the reason. The reason goes back to this notion that for Judaism, suffering is awful. That's why Jews were doctors in the Middle Ages, not just now, where it's almost a cliche, a Jewish doctor, right? I want a Jewish doctor, right? Is Rabbi Ginsburg or Rabbi Cohen Dr. Cohen? There's a Jewish joke, in fact. There was a Jewish joke about this. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Cohen are proud to announce the birth of their son, Dr. William Cohen. Where do these jokes come from? They come from reality. And especially today, you could have argued, well, it's a wonderfully lucrative profession, and so who wouldn't want to be a doctor? But when it wasn't lucrative in the Middle Ages, and it's not lucrative today nearly as much, you still have, it's still a dream for so many Jews, now females as well as males, to become a doctor. And whatever sociological reason, it goes back to the notion suffering is an evil, and it is up there with taking a life. Suffering is bad. It is not good. Now, there could be good that comes out of suffering. Jews aren't stupid. Obviously, there are lessons to be learned because Jews suffer like anybody else. And forget anti-Semitism. Just in daily life, everybody suffers. So I wrote a book called Happiness is a Serious Problem. If it weren't a serious problem, I wouldn't have written the book. So obviously everybody knows there's something to be learned from suffering, but the deepest Jewish belief is you get rid of it. It's not good to have. I'll give you one more anecdote. I was invited to Washington, D.C. a number of years ago to speak for a group called the Young Presidents Organization. It's a distinguished group of presidents of companies under the age of, I think, 40 or 45 or 50. I don't remember what the age is. As you get older, everything is young, so I don't remember anymore. And so I was invited, and it was a distinguished panel at a beautiful location in Washington, D.C. They had a distinguished Catholic priest, a distinguished Protestant minister, and I was the Jew. And we were not told what we would be asked. They wanted utterly spontaneous answers, and they began with the question of, all right, gentlemen, it was 3 men, all right, gentlemen, what, in your view, is the purpose of life? Why did God create people? You each have 3 minutes. So, thank God I went last. And I remember being dazzled by the eloquence of the Catholic priest and the Protestant minister. They really were beautiful. They spoke about the sanctity of life, the glorifying of God and involved in being alive. They were beautiful responses. And I knew what I was going to say, and I kept thinking, I'm telling you, they're going to regret inviting me. They'll think that I am some peasant compared to these eloquent theologians. And so I said, forgive me, after hearing these 2 beautiful statements about glorifying God and so on, you're going to wonder why you invited me, but I have to be honest with you, this is what I think. I think God created us humans to enjoy life. And nobody smiled, nobody laughed, and I'm really enjoying myself, but nobody else is. But that's what I believe. I believe that. I actually believe God so loves us, as if you will, he wants us to enjoy life. I mean, I have a lot of proofs for that. Yeah. I'll give you a few. Some will one is treading on thin ice, but no, skating on thin ice. So it's not treading in anything now that I think of it. Exactly. You know me and my metaphors. They're awful. Anyway, I often think, for example, why did God make all the fruit trees? God could have made one plant which has all nutrients, right? And we would live. But why apples and pineapples and bananas and peaches? Every time I see a fruit, I think, wow, what a gift. Thank you. It's dessert tree. Right? That's what most fruit are. They're nature's desserts. Now why are they there? There's no other purpose to a peach than to simply have pleasure. It has no other purpose, a peach. It's not particularly nutritious. It's just fun to eat. End of issue. I said I will be on thin ice, but I like to talk real, and this is in the sexual realm. Why does the woman have a clitoris? It plays no role whatsoever in reproduction. None. It has one purpose, joy. That's why joyless groups remove it. That's what clitoridectomy is about. It's, hey, you don't need one to procreate, and we don't want you to have much fun. Anti-joy religious groups are very scary. I like people who enjoy life. So do you. Even if you don't enjoy life, you much rather be with people who do. And so I think it is that's why God created us. Now, I didn't say to have fun, I said to enjoy life. The purpose of life is not to play video games or to live a Hugh Hefnerian life. That neither. It's not to be a hedonist, it's to enjoy life. I'll give you a Talmudic basis for this. The rabbis say God will ask you 5 questions. You, the Jew, will have 5 questions to answer when you die, and you have to appear before the heavenly host, the heavenly judge. And they include, did you have specific times every day to study Torah? Did you try to make a family? Did you deal honestly in business? And then there's this question. Which is my favorite of the 5. Did you enjoy every legitimate pleasure on earth? If you didn't, you have to account for it before God Almighty. I put all these pleasures on earth and you denied yourself. In the Torah itself, the Bible itself, a Nazirite, someone who takes a vow not to have wine. Now, I understand SDA and alcohol, it's a separate issue entirely, talking within a Jewish context. Not to cut his hair, not to have sex, not to have wine, and deny these various pleasures. I think it's in the book of Numbers. After the period of being a Nazirite, of being an ascetic, he has to bring a sin offering. It's a sin not to engage in the permitted pleasures of this world in Judaism. So to be an ascetic, or to be anhedonic, that's the opposite of a hedonist, is to deny yourself pleasure. That's a major biblical sin in Judaism. So there's a big basis for the belief that suffering is bad, that suffering should be removed in Judaism. And therefore, a lot of people see competing goods here, even religious people. The paramount, I believe paramount notion of preserving life, But let me tell you, there is a religious obligation in Judaism that is up there to reduce gratuitous human suffering. It isn't noble. It is awful. People in the last stages of body-eating cancers, I knew someone who was the most joyful, life-loving person perhaps I ever knew, who had colon cancer, and for whatever reason, the doctors did not reduce his pain sufficiently or could not reduce it sufficiently, and he finally jumped out of a window. The most fun-loving, life-loving human you will ever meet. He couldn't take it anymore and knew he was going to die anyway. So what is the purpose of life? What does it ennoble exactly was his question. This was not an atheist who jumped out of a window. We have to ask this question. We can't answer our ideological opponents if we don't take, certainly in this issue, don't take their arguments seriously. I don't know that human life is ennobled by having someone in certain physical states, certainly where they have lost their mind. I'm not for euthanasia. Please understand that. I'm against all laws that allow doctor-assisted suicide. And I'll come to that specifically in a moment about laws, but laws and morality are not the same thing. But I don't believe that keeping alive a brain-dead person ennobles God, glorifies God, ennobles life. Because what you're saying then is life is a purely biological statement. It has no content. It has no, and that's, I don't find that ennobling. But I could see the argument, who are we to judge? And I understand that. That's why I want you to know the question is far more complex, in my opinion, than is often granted by either side. I'll give you another example of suffering as a moral issue, which will disturb some of you, but I'd be dishonest if I didn't raise it. I object, as much as I believe that the vast majority of abortions in our country are immoral, I object to the equation of abortions in America with the Holocaust, which is often made by opponents of abortion. And I don't object because I'm Jewish. It has nothing to do with it. I object because it is not morally equivalent in my view, and the only reason is because of the suffering. Watching your children walked into a gas chamber, or being with them when it happens, or watching your child thrown alive into fires as the Nazis did when the gas chambers were too full, cannot be compared to the taking of a life of a human fetus, of an unborn child. There is, even if you hold that there is an equivalency with regard to the act of homicide, there is no equivalency with regard to the suffering, and that is a moral issue. It is a moral issue when a conscious adult knows what is happening and seeing their child burned alive. And that's what happened. 6 million saw that. The issue isn't 6 million, it's the suffering. Of course 6 million is an issue, but it's the suffering. Suffering is a morally qualitative issue, not merely death. Suffering itself is. Just now, with the miners in West Virginia, do you know what the articles are about? Some of them, anyway. Of course, the largest issue is the horror of being misled into thinking their loved one was alive. But there's another fascinating sub-context to this whole tragedy that happened in West Virginia. And that is that a lot of the miners left notes to their loved ones. They knew they were dying. Because carbon monoxide, you realize, you just start to get woozy, and you die. You go into a sleep. I knew a man who committed suicide by doing that. Closed his garage door, turned on his engine, and let the carbon monoxide put him to sleep. And do you know what the loved ones say? Oh, thank God we know he didn't suffer. What is the first question that parents ask if their child is killed in an accident or serving the country in a war? Did he suffer? Did she suffer? Those are real questions. Those are honest questions. They are also moral issues. And that's what prompts anyone to think about physician-assisted suicide, the immorality of gratuitous suffering, because that's what is involved so often. Now, we have here another issue. It's one of my favorites. It's called standards versus compassion. The standards crowd is usually the conservatives in America, and the compassion crowd is usually the liberals. Does this mean that no liberal has compassion, no conservative has compassion, no liberal has standards? No. But generally speaking, positions, not people I'm talking about, are we have to maintain the standards, whatever the price, and the liberal position is compassion for the individual overrules the standard for the many. That's how it usually works. And that's what we have here. And I side, and this brings me to the final chapter of my talk, what to do about physician-assisted suicide. I side with the standards crowd, but, and this is the but, I side with the standards crowd in the macro realm and with the compassion crowd in the micro realm. I have to explain this because this generally annoys only two groups, conservatives and liberals. Everyone else is very happy with this notion. I'll give you the best example because it's the toughest to me of all issues, homosexuality. Because if you know a homosexual, the person may be a jerk, just as there are heterosexual jerks. But homosexual is created in God's image like anybody else. Most true homosexuals, as opposed to the cavalier, I'll be a lesbian for a week actress, or for a year. True, especially male homosexuals, these men did not choose to be sexually attracted to men and not to be attracted to women. There's no straight man in this room who, whatever I did to you, would stop being attracted to attractive women. It is unimaginable to us who are straight, correct? Unimaginable that we would regard a picture of a beautiful woman in a bikini the same as we would regard a picture of a truck, okay? It's inconceivable to straight men in this audience. And so I didn't choose to be attracted to women, and gay men didn't choose to be attracted to men and not attracted to women. Now, if they're attracted to both, it's a separate story. But in any event, my point in all this is to tell you I really do have compassion for gays. Otherwise, I wouldn't have begun with what I just said. But at the same time, I have a standard that I do want to uphold, and that is the heterosexual ideal. That ideally, a man and a woman will unite. A man and a woman will have sexual intercourse, not a man and a man or a woman and a woman, to the extent that woman can be called sexual intercourse. But that is my ideal. My ideal is that they form a family. It's why I'm against same-sex marriage, because that is society announcing there is no difference. We couldn't care less. We are neutral. You want to base a family on having no mother? You want to base a family on having no father? Go right ahead. It's a non-issue to us because we have compassion for you, the individual. That's the liberal position. Compassion overwhelms standard. The conservative position is the standard has to be maintained no matter how much compassion we have for two wonderful gays, in the best scenario of two wonderful gays. My position is and then I will apply it to physician-assisted suicide. My position is you maintain your standards on social laws, on the societal level, but you have compassion trump standards on the one-to-one level. So that I will be loving, accepting of the gays in my life, co-workers, relatives. I will love them, I will accept them, I will have them over at my house, I will dine at their house. They are my fellow human beings, period, end of issue. At the same time, I don't want to see marriage redefined on a social level. Now, physician-assisted suicide. I am unalterably opposed to legalizing physician-assisted suicide. Society cannot make a statement that it's okay for doctors to kill people. Period. End of issue. It can't make that statement. Does that mean, though, that in every instance it's immoral? Back to my rabbi who was burned alive, if a physician were there and could inject him with something to end his suffering and kill him, would you think that the physician committed murder? Especially if it were a rabbi or a priest or an average Joe begging to be killed? No, of course not. So we have to keep it illegal. And yet, it doesn't mean that it can never happen. That's my position. Standards must be maintained, or you end up what you have in Holland, where increasingly people who don't voluntarily want to be euthanized are, in fact, because the doctors and the family have just decided that good old grandpa is really over the hill. Even though grandpa may have not decided that. Whatever safeguards you put up, they're going to be violated. And as written here by a Jewish woman who worked in a hospital. Now you know what goes on my radio show. Papers, just papers, always looking for papers. Here. Rabbi Dale Friedman, it's a woman, a chaplain at the Philadelphia Geriatric Center, which serves about 1,000 elderly Jews. I understand the longing for a way out for people that are suffering. I just happen to think this is the wrong way, she adds. There are an infinite amount of things that we can do to make the experience of dying better without putting in another human being's hands the authority and the power to kill somebody. The difficulty in defining, and this is from Chief Justice Rehnquist, in his decision on this particular issue from 1991. No, was it 97? Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure. How do you like that? I don't have a clue. I think it was from 1807, actually. Rehnquist lived a long, full life. The difficulty in defining terminal illness. That's right. The difficulty, what do you define it? You'll die in a year? You'll die in 6 months? You'll die tomorrow? How do you define it? People who are so careful about well, it's true that they were found guilty of multiple murder by multiple appeals, but they may be innocent. How about the people, but we can kill people who are innocent? And who, how do you know the doctor says terminal and they won't live? You don't think there are a lot of people walking around? I know there are people walking around who were told they had a terminal illness, and somehow it wasn't so terminal. They're still terminal 5 years later. The difficulty in defining terminal illness and the risk that a dying patient's request for assistance in ending his or her life might not be truly voluntary. That's right. How do you know it's voluntary? People say voluntary. How do you know what pressure even felt? Forget even put on by family members. Just maybe felt. I am a burden on my family. Get rid of me. justifies the prohibitions on assisted suicide we uphold here. This was Rehnquist. And this article from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency goes on to say, a doctor's first priority, most Jewish doctors and medical ethicists stress, is to save a patient's life. Yet at the same time, the conflict is that Judaism is extremely sympathetic to the easing of pain and suffering. And David Zweibel, who is Orthodox, General Counsel and Director of Government Affairs for the Agudath Israel of America, that's what's called the ultra-Orthodox, said, we as a Jewish community ought to have some special sensitivities about this in view of the euthanasia movement in Nazi Germany, because that's where they began before the Holocaust in their horribly, horribly dismissive statement, life unworthy of life. That's the way they described the undesirables that they got rid of. They were Germans, fellow Aryans, before they touched a Jew. And that's where I am at this moment, open to changing my mind. I am against all legalization of it, but I am not against it in every instance. How do we square that circle? It's very difficult. It's not fully possible. But there are too many examples where even a religiously infused human being would have to say, what are we serving by not answering this person's cry? And after all, if physician-assisted suicide is wrong, then suicide is wrong. What are you going to say? All right, look, a physician can't do it, but we understand this person I know who jumped out of a window. What if he were quadriplegic and couldn't get to the windowsill? And racked with pain, but could not move his body to get a bottle of pills to end it. So we need to keep... That is the loudest sneeze of my life. It was like divine. It was like thunder. That we have to keep, we who are religious, must be the fighters for standards, or we end up like Europe, and not the best of Europe, obviously. At the same time, we can't lose our hearts. God gave us compassion. It needs to be used. He uses it. We should too. But first and foremost, life is precious. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okie doke. Time for questions, comments, and brief alternate speeches. And feel free. I raised enough issues that perhaps you'll feel free to take any of them in. There's always I think we have a mic, though. Is that right? You want to just come up to the mic? There's one there, and there's one here if you want to line up. Please. Oh, just raise it. Like just turn the thing on the bottom and raise it. That's it. There you go.
Dennis, you spoke about being against assisted suicide, but I'd like to know if you could speak to the Jewish perspective of preserving life, and to what extent do we extend life, machinery, technology, and the like.
You will be having a rabbi in the next week, and